People often say, justice is blind, implying the law is impartial, favoring neither rich nor poor, noble nor common. But in Judge William Prescott's courtroom in the town of Oak Creek, justice wasn't just blind. She had been gagged, bound, and ruthlessly tossed out the back door. Oak Creek operated under an unwritten code that everyone knew by heart. If you were wealthy, powerful, and well-connected, you received a free pass for every sin. But if you looked like Naomi, a woman of color, elderly, and seemingly poor, you were guilty by default until you could prove you were broke. When Judge Prescott saw an older black woman in a faded hoodie standing before the bench, he didn't see a brilliant legal mind. He saw a joke. He laughed in her face. He mocked her accent. He thought he was the king of his tiny castle. But Prescott had no idea that the woman he was trying to humiliate wasn't just a defendant. She was his boss's boss's boss. And she didn't come here to beg for mercy. She came to deliver a verdict he would never forget. The air conditioning at the Oak Creek District Court seemed to have been broken since 1998. The air in the courtroom was thick and stifling, a cocktail of cheap floor wax, stale cafeteria coffee, and the sour sweat of people who knew their lives were about to take a turn for the worse. Naomi Caldwell sat quietly in the back row of courtroom 4B, hands folded neatly in her lap. She was 62 years old, with deep mahogany skin and salt and pepper hair pulled back in a simple, no-nonsense bun. Today, she wasn't draped in the heavy silk black robes that usually rested on her shoulders at the Supreme Court in Washington, D.C. Today, she wore gray sweatpants, comfortable sneakers, and an oversized navy blue hoodie with a peeling Myrtle Beach logo on the chest. She looked tired. She looked ordinary. To the untrained eyes of the snobs in the room, she looked like someone who had given up. But Naomi's eyes were different. They were razor sharp. They scanned the room, categorizing and memorizing everything. She watched the bailiff, a burly man named Mitchum, casually scrolling through his phone while a timid young man asked him where to stand. She watched the court clerk, Susan, who constantly rolled her eyes and shuffled files, treating the papers that decided people's fates like annoying junk mail. And above all, she watched the man on the bench, Judge William Prescott. He was a local legend, but for all the wrong reasons. A man in his 50s with a ruddy complexion and thinning blonde hair slicked back with too much gel. He didn't sit upright. He lounged, leaning back as if the courtroom were his private living room, and the defendants were uninvited guests interrupting his football game. Naomi had heard rumors about Prescott for years. She had family in Oak Creek. Her niece, Vanessa, lived just 3 blocks from the courthouse. 2 weeks ago, Vanessa had called Naomi in tears. "Auntie," Vanessa sobbed. "He didn't even listen. He just looked at Jamal, saw his tattoos, and gave him the maximum fine for a first-time noise complaint. He called him a thug right on the record. It isn't right, Auntie." Naomi had listened, her heart tightening. She knew the statistics. She knew the reality of the justice system better than almost anyone alive. But hearing it happen to her own blood, in the town where she was born, touched a different nerve. It wasn't professional anymore. It was personal. So, Naomi took a leave of absence. She told her clerks she was going fishing. She didn't tell them she was going to hook a shark. "Next!" Judge Prescott bellowed, slamming his gavel down, not for order, but for theatrical effect. A young woman stepped forward, trembling. She was there for an unpaid parking ticket. She tried to explain that she'd been in the hospital when the ticket was issued. "I don't care about your medical history, Ms. Davis," Prescott interrupted, his voice dripping with bored arrogance. "I care about city revenue. Double the fine. Installment plan denied." Next!" The girl burst into tears, but Bailiff Mitchum roughly nudged her out with his elbow. Naomi's jaw tightened. She felt that familiar fire rising in her chest, the cold fire that had pushed her through law school, through long nights of studying, and past the skepticism of professors who told her she'd make a better paralegal. She reached into her canvas bag and touched the folder inside. It wasn't a case file. It was property paperwork. Today, she wasn't Justice Caldwell. Today, she was just Naomi. She had manufactured a minor property dispute regarding her late mother's shed, a trivial matter that required a hearing. She had intentionally filed the papers with errors, intentionally dressed down, and intentionally made herself the kind of person William Prescott liked to eat for breakfast. Case number 4492, the clerk, Susan, H. read in a flat, monotone voice. The City versus Naomi Caldwell. Zoning violation and failure to maintain property structure. Naomi stood up. Her knees gave a soft crack. Age was a reality, even for Supreme Court justices. She walked slowly to the defendant's table. She didn't look down at the floor like the others. She looked directly at Prescott. He was looking at his wristwatch. State your name, he muttered, not bothering to look up. Naomi Caldwell, she said. Her voice was calm, deep, and clear. It was a voice that had silenced Senate hearings, but in the acoustic nightmare of this room, it sounded soft. Prescott finally looked up. He narrowed his eyes, his gaze raking over the hoodie, the sweatpants, and her empty hands. A smirk played at the corners of his mouth. Miss Caldwell, he said, leaning into the microphone so his voice boomed throughout the room. Are you aware that this is a court of law, not a Walmart checkout line? We have a dress code. Bailiff Mitchum snickered. A few lawyers in the front row, regulars who lived off Prescott's whims, gave polite, sycophantic laughs. Naomi didn't flinch. My apologies, Your Honor. My luggage was lost in transit. I thought arriving on time was more important than my fashion choices. Lost in transit, Prescott repeated, mocking her tone. Is that fancy talk for missing the bus? Look, let's make this quick. You have a shed on 4th Street that's an eyesore. The city wants it demolished. You haven't responded to 3 notices. Why? I never received the letters, Your Honor, Naomi lied smoothly. This was part of the test. The address on file is for the property itself, which is unoccupied. Proper protocol dictates that notice must be sent to the owner's primary residence. Prescott stiffened. He blinked. For a split second, the legal terminology registered, but then his ego took back control. He didn't like being corrected on procedure by a woman in a Myrtle Beach hoodie. Don't quote the law to me, Ms. Caldwell, Prescott sneered. I am the law in this room. You ignored the city. You're wasting my time. I am simply asserting my right to due process under... Bang! The gavel slammed onto the wood so hard it sounded like a gunshot. Silence! Prescott roared. His face turned a deeper shade of red. You want to play lawyer? Go to law school. For now, shut your mouth. I'm fining you $500 for the violation and another $500 for wasting the court's time with your attitude. Naomi stood very still. There it was. The trap had snapped shut. With all due respect, Naomi said, her voice dropping an octave into the steel blade she was famous for. You cannot impose a punitive fine for a civil zoning violation without an evidentiary hearing. That is a violation of the 14th Amendment. The courtroom went dead silent. The lawyers in the front row stopped giggling. They turned around looking at the old woman in the hoodie with sudden confusion. That wasn't how people in sweatpants usually talked. Prescott looked stunned for a heartbeat, but then his arrogance surged back twofold. He laughed, a loud, barking, ugly sound. The 14th Amendment? Prescott laughed, wiping a tear from the corner of his eye. Oh, that's rich. Listen to her. You've been watching too much TV. Let me tell you something, sweetheart. In Oak Creek, the Constitution is whatever I say it is. Now, get out of my sight before I hold you in contempt and throw you in a cell for the weekend. Naomi didn't move. Is that a threat, Judge Prescott? It's a promise, he spat. Bailiff, remove this woman, and Mitchum, check her for warrants. Usually when they talk this much, they're hiding something. Mitchum, the bailiff, loomed forward, grabbing Naomi's arm with unnecessary force. Let's go, old lady, Mitchum growled. Move it. Naomi yanked her arm back with surprising strength. She stared Mitchum down with a gaze that could freeze water. Do not touch me. Then she turned back to Prescott. Ha, you have made a grave mistake today, William, she said. She had dropped the, Your Honor. Prescott stood up, the veins in his neck bulging. That's it. 30 days. Contempt of court. Lock her up. Get her out of my sight. As Mitchum grabbed her again, hauling her toward the holding cells, Naomi didn't struggle. She didn't scream. She simply maintained eye contact with the judge, her face an unreadable mask of calm. She let herself be led away. She let the heavy metal door slam shut behind her. She let them take her fingerprints. Prescott thought he had just crushed another bug. He didn't know he had just swallowed poison. The holding cells in the court basement were far worse than the courtroom above. If the upstairs was an aesthetic nightmare, this place was a sensory hell of smell and touch. It reeked of long-standing dampness, the metallic tang of rusted bars, and the acrid sourness of unwashed bodies. There was a single metal bench bolted coldly to the wall and a toilet in the corner that looked more like a biohazard than a sanitary fixture. Naomi sat on the bench, keeping her back perfectly straight, as if she were sitting in the velvet armchair of her private chambers in Washington. They had confiscated her phone. They had taken the canvas bag containing her property deeds, but they couldn't take her mind. There were 2 other women in the cell. One was a young girl, perhaps only 19, with black mascara streaks running down her cheeks from crying. The other was a gritty-looking woman in her 40s with an ugly bruise along her jawline. The hardened woman stared at Naomi, her gaze a mix of curiosity and suspicion. "What are you in for, Mama?" the woman asked, her voice raspy. "Shoplifting?" Naomi smoothed the wrinkles on her sweatpants, her voice steady. "Contempt of court." The woman let out a long whistle of disbelief. "You actually talked back to Prescott? You got a death wish? That man is the devil incarnate. He sent my brother away for 5 years just for a joint in his pocket. He's a tyrant." Naomi nodded in agreement, her gaze fixed on the cracked concrete wall in the distance. "He is. But every tyrant has a weakness." "And what's his?" the woman asked, half believing, half skeptical. "He thinks he's untouchable," Naomi said, her voice cold and sharp. "Arrogance is a slow-acting poison. You don't feel the pain until you're already dead." The young girl in the corner sobbed, her breath hitching. "I'm so scared. I don't have the bail money. I'm going to lose my job at the diner. My mom is sick. She needs her medicine money." Naomi turned to the girl, the stern expression of a judge dissolving into the tenderness of a grandmother. "What's your name, dear?" "Becky," the girl whispered, her voice trembling. "Becky, listen to me," Naomi said, her voice carrying a maternal authority that commanded attention and trust. "You won't lose your job. When I get out of here, I'm going to make a phone call." The hardened woman let out a bitter laugh that echoed in the cramped space. "When you get out, Mama, you're serving 30 days. By the time you crawl out of this hole, Prescott will have forgotten you even existed. He doesn't remember the faces of the ants he steps on." Naomi smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. It was small, mysterious, and terrifying. "He won't forget," Naomi said softly, but with absolute certainty. "I'll make sure he remembers my name for the rest of his miserable life." She sat there, amidst the filth and despair, but the aura radiating from her made the space feel compressed. Prescott thought he had swallowed a weak prey. He didn't know that what he had just put in his stomach was a potent poison pill, and the casing was starting to dissolve. Meanwhile, upstairs, Judge William Prescott was enjoying lunch in his luxurious private chambers. He was devouring a meatball sub, the bright red marinara sauce dripping onto his thigh and staining his silk tie. He was laughing loudly with a local defense attorney, a slick-looking man named Greg Henderson. "Did you see that old woman?" Prescott laughed through a mouthful of food, breadcrumbs flying. "Was she quoting the 14th Amendment? Who does she think she is? I swear these commoners watch one episode of Law and Order and think they're Thurgood Marshall." Henderson gave a nervous chuckle, swirling the ice in his glass. "She was quite articulate, though, Bill. Did you notice her vocabulary? She sounded educated." "Educated, my foot?" Prescott scoffed, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "Please, probably some retired school librarian who's bitter at the world. She's a nobody, just another nuisance in my court." "You gave her 30 days, Bill." "For a zoning hearing," Henderson said tentatively. "Isn't that a bit heavy-handed?" Prescott stopped chewing and looked at Henderson condescendingly. "It's about respect, Greg. You let one of them talk back and the rest will follow. I have to maintain order. Besides, who's she going to call? The ACLU. They don't bother coming down to a backwater town like Oak Creek." Just then, the office door burst open. It was Susan, the court clerk. She looked ashen, white as a sheet of printer paper. Her lips trembled, unable to form words. "Judge," she stammered. "What is it, Susan?" Prescott snapped. "I'm eating lunch. Can't you see? There's a phone call for you. On line 1. "Take a message." Prescott waved her off. I can't, Your Honor. Susan's hands shook so violently she had to grip the doorframe to stay upright. It's the governor's office, and there's someone from the Department of Justice on the line. Prescott froze. The meatball sub hung suspended in midair. The governor? He frowned, a vague sense of unease starting to crawl through his gut. What for? Probably about the ribbon-cutting ceremony next week. No, sir, Susan whispered, her voice barely audible. They're asking about a prisoner, specifically the woman you just held in contempt, Ms. Caldwell. Prescott felt a tiny needle prick his stomach. Just a small prick, but it was ice cold. Caldwell? Why would the governor care about an old lady with a zoning violation? I don't know, sir, but the man from the DOJ, he didn't call her Mrs. Caldwell. Prescott dropped the sandwich onto his plate. What did he call her? Susan swallowed hard, her throat bone dry. He called her Justice Caldwell. The room fell into absolute silence. The only sound was the low hum of the air conditioner and a fly buzzing against the window pane. Justice? Prescott repeated the word, but it sat heavy on his tongue like lead. Justice Caldwell. He searched his memory frantically. Caldwell. Caldwell. He knew that name. He had heard it on the news, seen it in the case law he lazily skimmed through. He turned to his computer, fingers trembling as he typed Naomi Caldwell into the search bar. The first image that popped up was a formal portrait, a woman in powerful black robes standing next to the President of the United States. She looked regal, stern, and formidable. And she looked exactly, down to every detail, like the woman in the Myrtle Beach hoodie he had just thrown into the cages. Justice Naomi Caldwell, the third black woman appointed to the United States Supreme Court, famous for her scorched earth stance on judicial misconduct and civil rights violations. The blood drained from Judge Prescott's face so fast he nearly fainted. The world around him began to spin. Greg Henderson stood up abruptly, backing toward the door. I think I should go, Bill. Sit down, Prescott hissed, his voice cracking with terror. He stared at the screen, then at the door. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at his throat. It's a mistake, he whispered, trying to lie to himself. It has to be a mistake. Why would a Supreme Court justice be in my court wearing tattered sweatpants? But deep down, he knew. He remembered her eyes. He remembered the way she stood. He remembered her words. You have made a grave mistake. Susan! Prescott let out a croak like a stepped-on toad. Get Mitchum. Tell him to bring her up here, right now. Bring her to my chambers. Not the courtroom, my chambers. Yes, Your Honor. Susan vanished. Prescott stood up. His legs felt like jelly. He looked down at his tie. There was a large red stain from the meatball sauce. He frantically tried to rub it off, but the more he rubbed, the more the red smear spread like a bloodstain. In the mirror, he no longer saw a king. He saw a filthy butcher trembling before the hour of his execution. In the basement, the heavy iron door of the holding cell let out a piercing screech as it swung wide. But this time, there were no overbearing shouts. Mike, the hulking bailiff who had hauled Sarah away like a bag of trash, now stood at the threshold. His usual aggressive, arrogant demeanor was gone. His face was deathly pale, as if drained of every drop of blood, and beads of sweat the size of peas rolled down his forehead, soaking his tight uniform collar. In his hands was Sarah's old canvas bag. Trudy held it with both hands, cradling it as cautiously as if he were carrying a holy grail or an unexploded nuclear warhead, rather than an old woman's bag of knickknacks. Ma'am, Mike's voice cracked, sounding like a frog choking in his throat. Ms. Jones. Sarah was sitting on the cold metal bench, her back still perfectly straight. She slowly raised her eyes to look at him. She didn't stand up immediately. She let him wait. 1 second, 2 seconds, 5 seconds. Every passing second felt like a century of torture to Mike. Is there a problem, Deputy Mike? She asked, her voice terrifyingly calm. The judge wants to see you in his private chambers, Mike stammered, his eyes downcast, not daring to meet hers. Right now. Sarah stood up. She straightened her oversized Myrtle Beach hoodie and flicked an invisible speck of dust off her shoulder. She turned to the young girl cowering in the corner. Anna, she called softly. The girl looked up, her eyes red and filled with fear. "Don't worry, Anna," Sarah said, a rare slight smile appearing on her lips. "I haven't forgotten. Keep your spirits up." She walked toward the cell door. Mike scrambled backward, pressing himself against the wall to give her the widest possible path, as if fearing that a stray touch at this moment would be enough to turn him to ash. Would you like your bag, ma'am?" Mike held the bag out, his hands shaking so much that the keys at his hip jingled. Sarah glanced at the bag, then at Mike. Her gaze was ice cold. "Keep it," she said curtly. "I want my hands free." She stepped out of the cell, the soles of her old sneakers squeaking on the damp linoleum floor. She didn't walk like a prisoner being led to an interrogation. She walked like a general entering an enemy commander's tent to accept a surrender. Mike followed dejectedly behind her, not daring to step a half-inch ahead. The long hallway leading from the basement to the elevator, where he usually whistled and bullied prisoners, had become a walk of death. He didn't dare breathe heavily. He could feel the change in the air surrounding this woman. In that dark cell, she had just been a stubborn old woman. But now, under the flickering fluorescent lights of the elevator, she radiated an overwhelming aura, a silent power that seemed to suffocate the space around her. When the elevator doors opened on the third floor, Mike rushed forward, fumbling to hold the door for her. "This way, ma'am. Ms. Jones." Mike tripped over his tongue, sweat soaking the back of his shirt. He didn't know what to call her anymore. The sheer terror of her true identity was gnawing at his mind. They arrived before the thick oak door of Chambers 4. Mike gave a timid knock and pushed the door open. "Would you like me to continue translating the next part of this story for you?" Judge Tom was standing in the middle of the room. He had discarded his tomato-stained tie, and his white shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, revealing a neck flushed deep red from stress. He had tried to comb back his disheveled hair, but he still looked as haggard as if he'd just been in a physical brawl. In his hand, he held an expensive bottle of sparkling mineral water and a glass. His hand was shaking so violently that the glass clinked against the bottle. Clink, clink, a rhythmic rattling like teeth chattering in the cold. "Get out," Tom ordered Mike, his voice high-pitched and strained. Mike, looking as if he'd just received a presidential pardon, nodded frantically and vanished like a puff of smoke, closing the door with a soft but firm click. Only 2 people remained in the large, luxurious, mahogany-paneled room. Gold-framed certificates lined the walls, polished golf trophies stood in rows on the shelves, and a large American flag stood tall in the corner. All these symbols of power now seemed to be turning their backs on their owner. Sarah stood near the door. She didn't venture deep into the room. She just stood there, watching him. She looked at the expensive mahogany desk, the Persian rug beneath her feet, and finally at the man trembling with fear. "Justice Caldwell," Tom began, forcing a crooked smile that looked more like a grimace of appendicitis pain. I truly don't know how to apologize enough. There's been a terrible misunderstanding, a breakdown in communication." "If you had known," Sarah interrupted him, her voice cold and dry. "If you had known I was a Supreme Court justice, you would have behaved differently." "Is that what you mean?" Tom swallowed hard, his throat moving with difficulty. "Yes. Of course, professional courtesy among colleagues. But because you thought I was just Sarah Jones from 4th Street. She took a step forward. The sound of her footstep was soft, yet it made Tom recoil until he hit the edge of his desk. "Because you thought I was just a retired black woman, a nobody with a dilapidated shed, you treated me like cattle." Tom quickly set the water bottle on the desk for fear of dropping it. Water splashed across the polished wood surface. "Now, Justice, let's not dramatize the situation." Tom tried to salvage a shred of dignity, his voice trembling but attempting to sound reasonable. "I run a busy court. We deal with a lot of riffraff every day. Sometimes patience wears thin. It's a high-pressure job. You know that better than anyone." "Don't you ever," Sarah said, her voice not rising at all, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees Celsius. "Don't you ever presume to know what I know?" She stepped closer, her gaze piercing through him. I sat on the bench of the Southern District of New York for 15 years. I presided over terrorism trials, bloody RICO mafia cases, and billion-dollar corporate frauds. I have faced cold-blooded killers, But I have never, not once, stripped a citizen of their right to be heard. I have never laughed in the face of a defendant. She walked to the leather guest chair opposite his desk. She didn't sit down. She gripped the back of the chair with both hands, her knuckles white against the dark brown leather. Do you know why I'm here, Tom? The shed, Tom answered feebly. I can dismiss the case right now, wipe the record, act as if nothing ever happened. I'll return the fine. There is no shed, Sarah said. My mother's plot on 4th Street was cleared 5 years ago. It's a vacant lot. If you had bothered to read the file, if you had spared a glance at the photos provided by the city inspector, you would have seen that. But you didn't look. You only saw an old woman of color in a hoodie, and you stopped thinking. Tom's face went ghastly pale. He stammered. Then what did you come here for? And this has been going on for far too long, she continued, ignoring his question. I didn't come here for a zoning violation. I came here for Kevin. Tom blinked, bewildered. Kevin? Who is Kevin? Kevin Turner. The name fell into the air like a stone dropped into a still pond. Tom searched his memory. Turner. My nephew, Sarah added. Realization hit Tom like a sledgehammer to the gut. He stumbled back, forced to brace his hands on the desk to keep from collapsing. He remembered now. That kid. 2 weeks ago. Tattoos on his arms. Baggy jeans. A cocky but terrified expression. A noise complaint. Tom had thrown the book at the boy just to show off for the gallery. I didn't know he was your nephew, Tom groaned. That is exactly the point. Sarah slammed her hand onto the back of the chair. The sound cracked like a whip. That shouldn't have mattered. Justice is not about who you know or whose family you belong to. Justice is about the law. And you, William Prescott, you have turned this court into your own private kingdom where you tax the poor to feed your pathologically diseased ego. She reached into the pocket of her hoodie. For a second, Tom flinched, terrified she was drawing a gun. But what she pulled out was far more dangerous to a man like him. A small, black digital voice recorder. The red light was still blinking. I have been recording since the moment I walked through the security checkpoint, Sarah said, holding the device high. I have your voice mocking my appearance. I have your voice refusing to consider evidence. I have your voice issuing punitive fines without a hearing. And I have your voice admitting that the Constitution doesn't apply in your courtroom. Tom stared at the recorder. His career, his golf club membership, his lakefront vacation home, the power, the respect. It was all fast-forwarding before his eyes like a film about to snap. He knew this was his death warrant, and the executioner was standing right in front of him in the guise of a woman he had once deemed worthless. Would you like me to translate the final scene where the consequences unfold? Judge Tom stared at the tiny recorder in Sarah's hand. The red light blinked with a steady rhythm, like the heartbeat of a monster counting down the seconds until his demise. He felt his throat grow as dry as a desert, and his heart hammered against his chest, as if trying to break through his rib cage to escape. You can't use that, he whispered, his voice hoarse, desperately clinging to whatever scraps of legal knowledge he could remember. This is a two-party consent state for recording. You're breaking the law. That's inadmissible evidence. Sarah gave a thin smile. It was the smile of a hunter watching prey thrash in a net. Actually, she said, her voice terrifyingly calm, this state has a very clear legal exception regarding public officials performing their duties in a public office. But even if I couldn't use it in court, William, imagine how this recording would sound on the 6 o'clock news. Imagine what the State Judicial Fitness Committee will think when they hear your slurred voice mocking the Constitution. Tom stumbled around his desk. He looked desperate and dangerous. Sweat plastered his hair to his forehead. He lunged toward her, his trembling hand reaching out. Give me the recorder, Sarah, now, he growled, but the sound came out more like a whimper. We can settle this. I have friends, very powerful friends. The mayor owes me favors. The sheriff eats at my table. You think you can just walk into my town and set me up? Sit down. Sarah's command wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of 1,000 tons. Tom froze, his legs automatically obeying that authoritative order, and he collapsed into his expensive leather chair. You call this a setup? No, William, I call this an operation, Sarah said, her eyes glancing at the grandfather clock in the corner. And speaking of your powerful friends, the mayor and the sheriff, she looked him dead in the eye. It is currently 1:15 p.m. Right on schedule. FBI Special Agent Thomas Reynolds is walking into the mayor's office with a subpoena for financial records related to the new prison construction contracts. And I believe the state police are currently executing a search warrant at your private residence. They are seizing your personal computer, William. Tom's mouth hung open, his face turned from red to a deathly ashen gray. My house? He stammered. My computer. You didn't think I came here alone, did you? Sarah's voice softened, but not out of kindness. It was the gentle tone of a doctor informing a patient that their condition was terminal. I have been building this file for 6 months, she continued, each word a nail in his coffin. We know about the kickbacks from the private probation company. We know about the backroom deals between you and Greg Henderson to funnel wealthy clients to his firm for lighter sentences. We know you've been intentionally over-sentencing minorities to provide cheap labor for county prison work contracts. We know everything. William Prescott, the king of the Oak Creek District Court, buried his head in his hands. He began to weep. Pathetic, gasping sobs filled the opulent room. Please, he begged, tears and snot smearing his face. I have a family. My daughter is a freshman in college. This will destroy her. It will destroy all of them. Please. For the sake of professional courtesy. Sarah looked down at him from above. In her mind, she saw Anna, the young girl cowering in the cold cell, crying because she might lose her job at the diner. She thought of Kevin, her well-behaved nephew, thrown in with actual criminals just for loud music. She thought of the hundreds of families shattered at the hands of the man crying before her. You should have thought about your family, Sarah said, cold and final, before you decided to destroy everyone else's. At that moment there was a knock at the door. Knock, knock, knock. The sound was sharp, steel-clad, and authoritative. It wasn't the timid tapping of Mike or Susan. Come in, Sarah called out. The door swung wide. It wasn't Mike. Standing at the threshold were 2 tall men in perfectly tailored black suits, wearing the signature coiled earpieces. Behind them stood a state police officer in a formal uniform, hand resting loosely on his holster. The man in the lead stepped inside, holding up a gleaming gold badge. The light from the badge reflected into Tom's eyes, making him wince. Judge William Prescott, the man asked, though he already knew the answer. Tom didn't respond. He sat motionless like a melting wax statue, his mouth agape but making no sound. I am Special Agent Thomas Reynolds, FBI, the man declared, his voice booming like a final judgment. You are under arrest for racketeering, RICO, deprivation of civil rights under color of law, and wire fraud. Tom looked up, his eyes bloodshot and filled with tears. He looked toward Sarah. He was searching for a lifeline, a hint of mercy, or at least some industry intervention. But Sarah did not look away, nor did she smile in triumph. She simply stood there, observing him with the solemn expression of justice itself. Stand up, William, Sarah said. It's time to face the music. Agent Reynolds stepped forward, pulling a pair of cold steel handcuffs from his belt. Click, click. The sound of the metal snapping shut was bone dry. The powerful judge's hands were forced behind his back and locked tight. I need my jacket, Tom whimpered. I can't go out like this. Please, let me put on my blazer to cover the handcuffs. He was trying to cling to one last shred of dignity in front of his staff. His white shirt was soaked with sweat, clinging to his fleshy skin, and the red tomato sauce stain on his chest looked like a gunshot wound. Not permitted, Agent Reynolds said curtly. You're going now. The news spread faster than a forest fire. In a small town like Oak Creek, scandal travels at the speed of light. By the time the FBI agents escorted Judge Tom out of his private chambers, the main lobby of the courthouse had begun to buzz. Lawyers, clerks, and citizens waiting for their hearings all sensed something was wrong. The courthouse's dull, bureaucratic rhythm had been shattered by the arrival of black SUVs screeching to a halt at the front entrance. The ground floor elevator doors opened. Sarah stepped out first. She was still wearing the Myrtle Beach hoodie and gray sweatpants. But the way she walked, head held high, strides decisive, gaze unwavering, made the ordinary outfit look like the battle armor of an Amazon warrior. She didn't need black robes to project authority. Power radiated from her very being. Following directly behind her was William Prescott. He was sandwiched between the two tall FBI agents. His head was bowed toward the floor, trying to make himself as small as possible. No more slamming gavels, no more overbearing shouts. He was just an obese, middle-aged man, drenched in sweat and trembling in handcuffs. They had to walk through the central rotunda to reach the main exit. The noisy crowd suddenly went dead silent. The silence spread from one person to the next like a wave. Susan, the arrogant clerk from earlier, now huddled against the wall, hand over her mouth in horror. Mike, the bully bailiff, was trying to hide behind a large pillar, his face ghostly pale, praying that no one would notice him. Sarah stopped right in the center of the rotunda, beneath the soaring dome. The FBI agent stopped with her, respecting her silent command. She turned to face the room. There were about 50 people there, lawyers who had been silent accomplices, defendants waiting in fear for unjust sentences, impoverished families waiting for bad news. "Your attention, please," Sarah spoke. Her voice didn't need a microphone. It echoed off the marble walls, clear and powerful as a Liberty Bell. "My name is Justice Naomi Caldwell of the United States Supreme Court." A collective gasp of shock rose from the crowd. Phones were immediately hoisted into the air. Cameras began recording. Ordinary citizens stared wide-eyed at the woman in the hoodie whom they had assumed was a fellow sufferer. "For far too long," Sarah continued, pointing directly at the handcuffed man standing with his head bowed behind her. "This building has been a place of fear instead of justice. The man you called your honor has disgraced that title. He has sold your rights for profit. He has trampled the weak to please the strong. But today, that ends." She looked directly at the row of fixer lawyers, including Greg Henderson, the man who had just had lunch with Tom. Her gaze seemed to burn through them. "To the court officials who stood by and laughed while the law was desecrated," she said, her voice like steel. "Do not think you are safe. A full-scale audit is coming. If you were part of the corruption, we will find you. If you kept silent to protect your paycheck, you are not worthy of practicing law." Greg Henderson looked like he was about to vomit. He loosened his tie, eyes darting for an exit, but the doorways were blocked by state police. Then Sarah shifted her gaze to the long wooden benches where the ordinary people sat. She saw the mother of the girl with the parking ticket. She saw the bewildered young man from that morning. Her eyes softened, becoming warm and full of compassion. "To the citizens of Oak Creek," she said, "this court belongs to you. It belongs to the people, not the judges, not the lawyers, and certainly not the politicians. When the law is broken by those who swore to protect it, it is not a mistake. It is a crime. And today, we are prosecuting that crime." She turned back to Agent Reynolds and gave a slight nod. "Take him away." The agents nudged Tom forward. As he passed through the crowd, a sound erupted. Clap, clap, clap. It was the sound of applause. Slow at first, started by the young girl who had been wrongly fined for the parking ticket. Then another joined, then another. Within seconds, the entire hall exploded into thunderous applause and deafening cheers. It wasn't a celebration of someone else's suffering. It was the sound of relief. It was the sound of a heavy iron boot finally being lifted off the necks of innocent people. Judge William Prescott was pushed through the revolving glass doors. The flashes of press cameras outside flickered incessantly, blinding him. Local news stations were already on the scene. He would be the hottest news story of the day, the face of shame and corruption. Sarah didn't follow him out immediately. She had one more thing to do. She turned to Mike, the bailiff trembling behind the pillar. "Deputy Mike," she called his name. Mike jumped as if he'd been electrocuted. Yes, Justice. I believe you are holding several people in the cells, a young girl named Anna and another woman." "Yes, I'll go release them immediately." "Bring them up here," Sarah ordered, "and bring their paperwork with them." She stood in the center of the hall, the old hoodie now looking more magnificent than any royal robe. She waited to perform the final act of justice for the day, setting the innocent free. 10 minutes later, the elevator doors opened once again. Bailiff Mitchum stepped out, but this time he didn't lead with his usual swagger. He walked backward, cringing like a beaten dog, clearing the way for two women to emerge from the shadows. Becky and the woman nicknamed Mama entered the brightly lit main lobby. They squinted. B, confused by the sudden change in environment. They saw the buzzing crowd, the flashing television cameras, and the line of state police officers cordoning off the exits. And then, they saw the old woman in the Myrtle Beach hoodie standing at the center of it all, as majestic as a queen in the midst of a chaotic court. Becky rushed forward, her eyes wide with shock. She looked at Naomi, then out toward the glass doors where the FBI vehicle had just departed. "Naomi, what happened?" Becky stammered, her voice still trembling with fear. "I heard clapping, and Bailiff Mitchum, he—" Naomi smiled, a kind, warm smile, worlds apart from the cold mask she had worn for Prescott. "Judge Prescott had to leave early, Becky," Naomi said softly. "An unexpected career change. He won't be coming back." She turned to Mitchum. The bailiff flinched, his hands shaking as he held out a thin folder. "They're files. Here they are." "Ma'am, Justice," Mitchum said, sweat pouring down his neck. Naomi took the folder. She glanced over the papers, the nonsensical citations, the fine amounts scribbled out of pure greed. With a decisive motion, she ripped the folder in half. The sound of tearing paper echoed sharply through the silent hall. She tore it again into quarters, then eighths, until they were nothing but meaningless scraps. "You're free to go," Naomi declared. "But what about the bail money?" Becky asked anxiously, clutching the hem of her wrinkled diner uniform. "I don't have any money." "There is no bail," Naomi said firmly. "These charges were based on an illegal order from a corrupt official. Now I have vacated them in my capacity as a Supreme Court justice." She looked at Mitchum, her gaze as sharp as a blade. "Isn't that right, Deputy?" "Yes, ma'am. Absolutely correct." Mitchum nodded frantically, like a chicken pecking at grain. The woman named Mama looked at Naomi with a mix of shock and admiration. She shook her head and clicked her tongue. "You weren't kidding. You really are heavy-duty karma." "Karma has no deadline," Naomi replied thoughtfully, "but occasionally I like to speed up its delivery." She reached into the pocket of her sweatpants and pulled out a small ivory-colored business card with a name and phone number embossed in gold. She placed it in Becky's calloused hand. "Becky, this is the number for my personal scholarship foundation. We specialize in supporting young women whose lives have been unfairly impacted by the legal system so they can return to school." Becky looked at the card, and tears began to flow. But this time, they were tears of hope. "Call this number Monday morning," Naomi instructed, placing a hand on the girl's shoulder. "Tell them Justice Caldwell sent you. You won't be working at that diner forever. You're going to college." Becky burst into tears and threw her arms around Naomi. Naomi patted the girl's back, her eyes looking over her shoulder toward the empty bench where Prescott once sat. The cleaning crew had already begun sweeping the floors, clearing away the dust, but Naomi knew the real trash had been taken away in handcuffs. She walked out of the courthouse and into the brilliant afternoon sun. The air seemed cleaner. The stifling summer humidity seemed to have vanished. Just as she reached the bottom of the steps, a sleek black sedan pulled up. A young man in a perfectly tailored suit stepped out and opened the rear door for her. It was David, her private clerk who had flown in from Washington, D.C. "Justice Caldwell," David said quickly, his face professional. "We have a flight back to Washington in 3 hours. The confirmation hearings for the new appellate judges start tomorrow morning. We need to review the briefs." Naomi paused. She turned her head to look back at the Oak Creek District Court one last time. She pulled the hood of her Myrtle Beach sweatshirt over her head, hiding her salt and pepper hair. "Let them wait, David," she said, a mischievous smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Yar, I think I want to stop for a cheeseburger first. Delivering justice makes me hungry." While Judge Prescott was being processed at the very county jail where he had imprisoned hundreds of innocent people, the aftershocks of his arrest were turning the underground power structure of Oak Creek into a disaster zone. Greg Henderson, the sleazy defense attorney who had mocked Naomi's uneducated voice just an hour earlier, was currently driving his silver Mercedes at 90 miles per hour down the interstate. He wasn't going home. He was racing to his law office. His hands shook so violently on the steering wheel that the car kept swerving into the next lane. In his mind, the image of the old woman in the hoodie transforming into a Supreme Court justice replayed like a horror movie. He knew what the word audit meant. It meant they would look into the trust accounts. They would find the phantom consulting fees he had funneled into a shell company under the name of Prescott's wife. He slammed on the brakes, tires screeching on the asphalt of the Henderson and Associates parking lot. He didn't even bother to lock his car, bursting into the building like a madman. "Mr. Henderson?" Brenda, the receptionist, looked up in surprise. "The mayor's waiting on line 2. He sounds very angry." "Tell him I'm dead!" Greg shouted, slamming his office door shut and locking it. He lunged for the filing cabinet, his fingers frantically flipping through folders. He needed the Pineview file. This was the knot that no one in the courtroom, except Justice Caldwell, truly understood. Naomi's zoning violation wasn't an accident. Her mother's plot on 4th Street was the final piece in a massive land grab conspiracy directed by Mayor Clint Gable and executed by Judge Prescott. They had used their power to declare homes in the historic black neighborhood blighted or slap them with impossible zoning fines. When residents couldn't pay, the city would seize the houses and sell them for a pittance to a private developer to build luxury condos. Greg found the blue folder. His hands fumbled as he flicked his Zippo lighter. He tossed the folder into the metal trash can beneath his desk. Flick, flick. The lighter sparked but wouldn't catch. "Burn! Burn, you piece of trash!" Greg yelled, sweat drenching his forehead. Suddenly, the office door burst open. It wasn't Brenda. It was a woman in a sharp gray suit holding a cardboard box. Standing behind her were 2 burly state troopers. "Mr. Henderson," the woman said calmly, "I'm a representative from the State Bar Disciplinary Committee. We have just received an emergency order suspending your law license." Greg froze, the lighter still in his hand. You can't be in here. This is private property." "And that action," the woman pointed to the trash can and the lighter, "is called an attempt to destroy evidence. Officers?" Greg dropped the lighter. As the cold handcuffs locked onto his wrists, he looked out the window. Across the street was a massive billboard for the Pineview Luxury Residences project, featuring images of fake happy families. The sign was peeling at the corner, and so was his life. Across town in City Hall, Mayor Clint Gable was experiencing a different level of panic. He wasn't running, he was dug in. Gable was a tall man with manicured silver hair and the industrial smile often seen on campaign posters. But right now, he was sitting in a darkened office, curtains drawn tight, holding a glass of expensive scotch. On the wall-mounted TV, the news was showing footage of Prescott being shoved into an FBI vehicle, his head bowed in shame. "Idiot," Gable muttered, draining his glass in one gulp. "Arrogant, careless idiot." He picked up his desk phone and dialed Sheriff Miller. "Miller," Gable roared as soon as the other end picked up, "tell me we have the situation under control. Tell me Prescott is keeping his mouth shut." "I don't know, Mr. Mayor." Sheriff Miller's voice sounded tiny and distant. "The FBI has him in an isolation room. They won't let my people near him. And, sir, there's a rumor." "What rumor?" "They say Justice Caldwell didn't just bring the FBI. They say she brought a forensic accountant from the IRS." Gable felt the blood drain from his face. "The IRS? The FBI looks for crimes, but the IRS looks for money, and the dirty money trail led straight to Gable's re-election fund." "Listen, Miller," Gable hissed through gritted teeth, "go down to the evidence locker right now. The city planning department hard drive, the one we seized from the inspector last year. I need it to disappear. Water damage, a short circuit, a fire, I don't care. Just make it go away." I can't do that, Mr. Mayor." "What? What do you mean you can't? I'm the one who signs your paycheck." "Turn on the TV, sir." Miller's voice trembled. "Channel 5, right now." Gable grabbed the remote and switched channels. The screen showed live footage from outside a local diner called Mars Kitchen. A crowd was cheering outside the window, and sitting at the table right by the window, enjoying a burger, was Naomi Caldwell. But she wasn't sitting alone. Opposite her was Jamal, Kevin, her nephew, who had just been released, and sitting next to Jamal was a man with thick glasses, clutching a large stack of documents. Gable recognized the man instantly, and a cold chill ran down his spine. It was Arthur Pims, the former city planning employee. The man Gable had fired and silenced 2 years ago for refusing to sign off on fraudulent zoning maps. The reporter on screen spoke with excitement. "We have received word that Justice Caldwell is conducting an informal interview right here at the diner with Arthur Pims, a whistleblower who claims to hold evidence of a massive embezzlement scheme involving City Hall." Gable dropped the phone. The Scotch glass slipped from his hand, hitting the hardwood floor and shattering into pieces. The glass shards scattered everywhere. She hadn't just come here to catch a corrupt judge. She had come to tear down the entire kingdom. Inside the Mars Kitchen diner, the air felt electric. The owner, a large woman named Ma Higgins, had hung a closed sign outside to keep the curious public at bay, but she kept the coffee pot constantly refilled on the table of Naomi and her special guests. Naomi wiped a small smear of ketchup from her lip with a napkin. She looked at Jamal, her beloved nephew, sitting opposite her. He looked thinner than the last time she'd seen him, and in his eyes there was a hardness, a wariness that had never been there before. "I'm sorry, Aunt Naomi," Jamal said softly, his eyes fixed on his interlaced hands on the table. "I didn't know you were coming. I didn't want you to see me like this in that orange jumpsuit." Naomi reached across the table and squeezed Jamal's hand firmly. Her hand was warm and steady. "Jamal, look at me. The shame does not belong to you. The shame belongs to those who locked you away just to fill an arrest quota. You are a victim, not a criminal." "But I really did play my music loud," Jamal smiled sadly. "Loud music is a nuisance, Jamal," Naomi said firmly. "It is not a crime deserving of jail. They exploited you. They used you and hundreds of other young men of color to create a false narrative that this neighborhood is dangerous and crime-ridden. The goal was to drive property values as low as possible and buy the land for a pittance." She turned to the small man sitting next to Jamal. Arthur Pims, the former planning employee, was clutching a thick file folder to his chest like a bulletproof shield. He kept pushing his thick glasses up his nose as he sweated. "Mr. Pims," Naomi said, her voice shifting from the tone of an aunt to the tone of a justice, "you are safe now. The federal witness protection program has been activated, though I doubt you'll need it after the indictments are unsealed. Tell me about the mayor." Arthur tremblingly opened the folder. His fingers skimmed through pages filled with numbers and charts. "Mayor Gable and Judge Prescott had a deal," Arthur explained in a small voice. "No, Prescott would impose maximum fines on District 4 homeowners for the tiniest infractions: uncut grass, peeling paint, cracked sidewalks. When the homeowners couldn't pay thousands of dollars in fines, the city would place a lien on the property," Naomi finished for him. "Exactly," Arthur nodded. "And then they would foreclose. They'd kick families out onto the street, and the mayor would sell those assets to Pineview Holdings for a fraction of their value. And Pineview Holdings is owned by the mayor's brother-in-law." Jamal slammed his hand on the table, making the coffee cups jump. "Those bastards! They're stealing our homes. They locked me up just to steal Grandma's house." "That was the plan." Naomi's gaze was ice cold. "They thought that if they targeted the poor, the marginalized, those who couldn't afford a good lawyer, no one would notice. They thought we were invisible." She took a sip of black coffee. "They forgot that even invisible people have a voice. And sometimes," she smiled grimly, "that voice carries the weight of the United States Supreme Court." Suddenly, the wind chime hanging on the diner door jingled. The entire room went silent. Mayor Clint Gable walked in. He was alone. He looked disheveled, pathetic. His expensive blazer was gone, his shirt sleeves were messily rolled up, and his face was gaunt, as if he hadn't slept in a week, even though the crisis had only begun 3 hours ago. Agent Reynolds and 2 other FBI agents, who had been posing as customers eating pie at the bar, immediately stood up, hands resting near their sidearms. "Sit down, agents," Naomi said calmly, her eyes never leaving her half-finished burger. "Let the mayor speak." Gable walked to the table. He looked at Arthur Pims, who was cowering. He looked at Jamal with his usual contempt. And then he looked at Naomi. "Justice Caldwell," Gable's voice was as raspy as sandpaper on wood. We need to talk." "I'm eating lunch, Mr. Gable," Naomi said, "and I don't typically converse with unindicted co-conspirators during my meals." "You don't understand," Gable pleaded, leaning his hands on the table. "Prescott, he went rogue. I had no idea about those harsh sentences. I'm also a victim of his deception. I came here to pledge my full cooperation with the investigation." Naomi slowly set her burger back on the plate. She took a napkin and dabbed the corners of her mouth. She turned fully to face him. Her look was powerful enough to peel the paint off the walls. Mr. Mayor, she said slowly, do you know what the sentence for federal conspiracy to commit fraud is? It's not 30 days, it's 20 years. I didn't know anything. Arthur, Naomi ordered, gesturing toward the folder. Show him page 42. Arthur Pims tremblingly flipped through the folder and turned it toward the mayor. It was a printed copy of an email from Mayor Clint Gable to Judge William Prescott. Subject 4th Street matter body, crank up the fines. We need the Caldwell lot by November. If the old lady won't sell, condemn it. Make her life a living hell. Gable stared at the paper. The blood drained from his face, making him look like a wax statue about to melt. You knew exactly about the fines, Naomi said softly but powerfully. You knew exactly about the foreclosures, and you specifically targeted my mother's property because you thought she was just a weak old woman who wouldn't fight back. Gable backed away, bumping into a chair. That's a forgery. It's fake. It was pulled from your secure server. Agent Reynolds stepped forward, his voice cold. We just finished mirroring your hard drive. We have everything, Mr. Mayor. The emails, the bank statements, the kickbacks, everything. Gable looked at the door. For a split second, the instinct to run took over. Don't, Naomi said. Don't add resisting arrest to the list. Show a shred of dignity, Clint, for once in your life. Gable collapsed. His shoulders slumped. The arrogance that had sustained him for decades evaporated, leaving only a small, greedy man. Base Agent Reynolds pulled out his handcuffs. Clint Gable, you are under arrest. As the click of the cuffs locked around the mayor's wrists, Jamal stood up. He walked over to stand in front of Gable. Gable flinched, cowering as if he expected the young man to hit him. But Jamal just looked him straight in the eye. My name is Jamal Turner, he said, his voice clear and resonant. I am not a thug. I am not a crime statistic. I am a pre-med student, and I am the one who's going to watch you go to prison. Gable bowed his head, unable to meet the young man's gaze. As the agents led the mayor out of the diner, the crowd outside exploded in cheers once again. The roar was like the bursting of a dam that had been held back for far too long. Naomi let out a sigh of relief and picked up a French fry. Well, she said to Arthur Pims, who was breathing a sigh of relief. That's the local government settled. Now, let's talk about that real estate developer. She wasn't finished yet. Hard karma was only just getting started. The federal case against Pineview Holdings moved as swiftly as a summer storm, with both former Judge Prescott and former Mayor Gable singing like canaries in hopes of reduced sentences. The real estate tycoon, Charles Thorpe, tried to flee to the Cayman Islands. He was intercepted by the FBI right on the tarmac before his private jet's engines could even warm up. But the true drama didn't lie in the arrests. It lay in the money. Usually, when the government seizes assets from a criminal organization, that money vanishes into the bottomless black hole of the federal treasury. Victims receive a sense of moral justice, but they rarely get their lives back. The lost homes remain lost. However, Naomi Caldwell didn't play by the usual rules. 3 months after the arrests, during the asset forfeiture hearing, Naomi filed an amicus curiae brief. In it, she argued a fresh legal theory she called restorative justice through community land trusts. She argued that since the $42 million in Charles Thorpe's accounts was extracted directly from the stolen equity of the homeowners on 4th Street, that money should not go into public funds. It had to be returned to the very people from whom it was stolen. The courtroom was packed. The new presiding judge, Judge Olcott, a stern but fair woman whom Naomi had mentored years prior, read the petition in silence. Government prosecutors wanted the money. The banks wanted the money. Judge Olcott looked up over her reading glasses. She looked toward the gallery filled with families who had been evicted, including young Becky. Then she looked toward Naomi, who sat quietly in the back row, knitting a wool scarf. The court finds Justice Caldwell's logic irrefutable, Judge Olcott declared, slamming her gavel. The assets of Pineview Holdings are hereby transferred into a trust for the immediate reconstruction of the 4th Street District. The government will not take a single cent until every homeowner has been made whole. The courtroom erupted. It wasn't just a legal victory. It was a transfer of wealth unlike anything Oak Creek had ever seen. Karma didn't just punish the wicked. It funded the righteous. The villains didn't just lose, they were forced to pay to rebuild the very place they tried to destroy. Well, 1 year later. The Oak Creek District Court looked the same on the outside, but on the inside, the ghosts had been swept away. At a state penitentiary 3 counties away, former Judge William Prescott was no longer Your Honor. He was inmate number 9440. His days of lounging in a leather chair were over. Now he spent his mornings working in the prison laundry, laboring to scrub stains out of other men's uniforms, a poetic irony lost on no one. He had tried to appeal his 20-year sentence, but the appellate court rejected his petition with a single sentence, citing the indisputable evidence preserved by Justice Caldwell. Back in Oak Creek, the vacant lot on 4th Street where Naomi's mother's shed once stood had completely changed. It wasn't a luxury condo. Then it was a handsome red brick building with a gleaming bronze plaque, the Caldwell Community Legal Center. On a cool autumn afternoon, Naomi stood before the new building. Standing beside her was Jamal, who had finished his first year of medical school with a perfect 4.0 GPA. Becky, the girl who once cried in a jail cell, was also there. She was working as the center's receptionist by day and attending paralegal classes by night. "You did all of this, Aunt Naomi," Jamal said, adjusting his glasses. "You took down an entire system." Naomi smiled, looking across the street where children played safely on clean sidewalks, the street no longer labeled a slum. "I didn't take it down, Jamal," Naomi gently corrected. "I just reminded them that the sword of justice has 2 edges. They thought they were the kings of this town. They forgot that even kings must answer to the law." She looked at the bronze plaque by the door. It didn't bear her name. It bore the names of all the families who had reclaimed their homes. "Come on," Naomi said, turning toward her waiting car. "I have a session in Washington on Monday, and I hear there's a newly appointed judge in Oak Creek I need to keep an eye on." "Is he corrupt?" Becky asked worriedly. Naomi laughed, a warm and genuine sound. "No, he's terrified, and that is exactly how a judge should feel, terrified of ever ruling wrongly." As the sun set over the town of Oak Creek, the shadows no longer felt threatening. This small town had learned the hardest lesson of all. You can judge a book by its cover, but if you judge a Supreme Court justice by her hoodie, you will get burned. And that was how Justice Naomi Caldwell proved that true power needs no robes or gavels. It only needs the truth. Judge Prescott thought he was crushing a weak old woman, but he had personally lit the fuse that destroyed his own corrupt empire. It served as a powerful reminder that karma, when served correctly, is the most satisfying verdict on earth. Judge Prescott imagined he was trampling a helpless old woman, only to end up dismantling his own corrupt empire with his own hands. This story is the ultimate proof that you should never judge by appearances and that retribution always arrives on time in the most satisfying way. If you were in Sarah's position, would you have revealed your identity right at the start to intimidate him, or would you have patiently set the trap as she did? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next dramatic stories of karma. Thanks for watching.